This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. The case of Dana Air Flight 0992 is one based in chronic airline mismanagement at a multitude of levels. A complete breakdown in aircraft operation, maintenance, and workplace culture compounded against pilot error, leading to this devastating disaster which killed 159 people when this passenger plane crashed into residential housing just a few minutes away from landing at Lagos Airport in Nigeria. When I originally began reading up on this horrifying accident, I didn't really know what to expect. I certainly wasn't expecting to uncover the inner workings of an airline teetering on the edge of what is considered to be acceptable airworthiness. At times, reading over the deeper layers of the story, I just couldn't believe what I was reading. Allow me to read you some of the closing notes here from the investigation real quick. The inappropriate omission of the use of the checklist, lack of situational awareness, inappropriate decision-making, poor airmanship. But let's rewind here. How does all of this tie together? Well, come with me, my viewer. Let's explore the events of this accident together. But first, let me tell you about today's sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is an award-winning streaming service dedicated to bringing their subscribers only the best educational documentaries on subjects ranging from science, history, technology, military, music, food, and of course you'll even find a selection of great aviation content. Needless to say, there is something for everyone on CuriosityStream. They drop new and even exclusive content every week that you just can't find anywhere else. With plans starting under $5 a month, you gain access to thousands of hours of high-quality documentaries and series. Choose what's best for your budget with monthly and annual plans. Be flexible with your viewing, watch on TV, on mobile, or even combine them, as CuriosityStream is available on a multitude of devices. Personally, I've had some documentaries on whilst editing this very video, like The Antonov Dream on the legendary Antonov 225. Watched it right here on my desktop. You can watch great documentaries and learn something new, anytime, anywhere. If you're the type of person looking to learn something new today, why not head over there using my link, curiositystream.com/disaster. You'll find it in the pinned comment and description. Head over there now and be sure to use promo code DISASTER and save 25% off an annual subscription right now. curiositystream.com/disaster. A big thank you to CuriosityStream for supporting the channel, paying the bills, and with all of that said, let's get on with the video. It was a relatively clear day in Nigeria on June 3rd, 2012. At just before 3 in the afternoon, Dana Air Flight 0992 departed the city of Abuja in central Nigeria for a short domestic flight down to Lagos. It's a journey of just over 300 miles, a little over 500 kilometers. Flight time of about 1 hour. This is the most widely traveled air route in the country. Dozens of flights between the two cities take off and land every single day. Dana Air is just one of numerous Nigerian airlines that have claimed a piece of that Lagos-Abuja pie. Dana Air's route network is entirely domestic-based, and like many recent startup African carriers, the airline employs older second-hand aircraft, such as the older models of Boeing 737 acquired from Southwest Airlines, and a number of McDonnell Douglas MD-80 series aircraft. This particular plane was a 1990 manufactured MD-83 that was originally delivered to Alaska Airlines before being sold to Dana Air in 2009. The MD-80 has been, in its time, one of the most popular airliners to ever take to the skies. Nearly 1,200 of these things were built, and it was McDonnell Douglas's best-selling plane before their acquisition by Boeing in the 1990s. You will hear former MD-80 pilots today talk favorably about the plane. It boasted impressive performance, and despite it being a noisy aircraft, it was relatively quiet in the front due to the engines being rear-mounted. Pilots called it the Mad Dog, a fitting name to go with the quirky design elements of the aircraft. However, the Mad Dog is a plane that, today, has slowly been drifting further into the abyss of aviation history at this point. Even in 2012, it was an aging plane, and airlines that still had MD-80s back then were looking ahead and scheduling their retirement in favor of newer planes. This meant that a lot of these things ended up in the used aircraft market. and some can still be found today, albeit in dwindling numbers. Even Dana Air still flies the MD-80 today, even despite all of the troubles that have plagued the airline. No doubt we'll be touching up on said troubles throughout this video. But the plane was not the only aspect of this flight that was American. Up on the flight deck, the plane was being commanded by an American pilot, 55-year-old Captain Peter Waxton. With 18,000 flight hours to his name, he was hired by Dana Air earlier that same year and had only been flying as a captain with the airline for about 1 month. He does, though, have extensive experience in the MD-80, with 7,500 flight hours logged in the type. He was joined on the flight deck by another foreign national to Nigeria. The first officer, 34-year-old Mahendra Singh Rathore, was from India and became a pilot at the airline in 2011. He was much less experienced, being a much younger pilot, having logged around 1,100 flight hours by the time of the accident. The first officer had emigrated to Nigeria before taking on this pilot job at the airline, and was originally hired by Dana Air as Director of Cabin Service. For the aircraft, Flight 0992 was actually the fourth flight of the day. The plane had previously made one successful return trip out of Lagos going to Abuja. This flight, the accident flight, was the return trip on the second outing that day. In total, Dana Air Flight 0992 was carrying 153 passengers and crew. In addition to the two pilots, there was one Indonesian national who was an aircraft engineer on board. But let's refocus on the captain here for just a minute. When one delves deeper into the accident of Dana Air 0992, you'll inevitably come across some interesting information regarding Captain Waxton. Information that investigators later found damning in relation to how this tragedy unfolded, not only in exposing just how poorly this airplane was managed, but also the deeper problems within Dana Air. To begin with unpacking the deeper details here, let's first take a closer look at the pilot's aviation background. Let's tackle the obvious question. Why did this American pilot have a job here in Nigeria and not, say, a piloting job in America? Captain Peter Waxton, when he wasn't in Nigeria, actually lived in Florida. Seriously, a Florida address was put down on his official Nigerian pilot's license filed with the Nigerian Civil Aviation Authority. Now, it's not uncommon for pilots to find work abroad, so this alone is not all that unusual. It's also not uncommon, especially in a large country like the United States, for pilots to go on work trips. Maybe they'll leave home, fly around to the country over the course of multiple days, staying in hotels, and then fly home. They have days on and days off. It's been known to happen. I was not able to confirm if Mr. Waxton had a more permanent accommodation arrangement in Nigeria, but the on-off arrangement is kind of what we have here. According to one source, the captain did 30 days in Nigeria and 15 days off. In fact, the day of the accident, the day of his death, was the last day he was to spend in Nigeria before returning to Florida. Now, what is unusual here is that this arrangement was here in the first place. You see, Captain Waxton did actually have a pilot job based nearby to his home in Florida. So, why the move? Well, here is what we know. Prior to 2009, Mr. Waxton's commute was not so extreme. Between the years of 1997 and 2009, he flew as a pilot with Spirit Airlines, presumably out of Fort Lauderdale, which was where he lived. Now, as to how the change from Spirit Airlines to Nigerian Dana Air came about, that is really quite interesting. I mean, that doesn't really seem like a normal thing to do. Trading one for the other on the other side of the Atlantic seems a bit excessive. In 2009, Captain Waxton moved from Spirit Airlines to a smaller charter airline known as Falcon Air Express. This new job didn't last long because his license had been suspended by the Federal Aviation Administration due to a string of heavy, unsafe landings and for failing to report key maintenance. Now, the provided Nigerian certification document we have here also contains a license number associated to the United States. We can then take this number and run it through the FAA's own airman inquiry, where we find that the captain had a new airline transport pilot license issued in August 2011. Now, what appears to have happened here is that he took that to Nigeria, got a new license to fly there, and was then hired by Dana Air in March of 2012, 3 months before the accident that would take his life. Spirit Airlines and Falcon Air Express both flew the MD-80, and it was with Spirit Airlines where the captain built up most of his experience and knowledge with the plane. Due to his extensive time with the aircraft, this might well be why he went to Dana Air. But that's only the beginning of the captain's unusual state of a career. We need to talk about his state of affairs in Nigeria. Air crash investigators later retrieved the relevant documents pertaining to the captain, only to find that though his license had been stamped, it had not been signed by the relevant persons at the Nigerian Civil Aviation Authority, the NCAA. Recommendation documents also supplied to the NCAA and Dana Air had also not been signed. Captain Waxton was supposedly given pilot training in Nigeria under the supervision of a training captain, who made a number of interesting remarks regarding this captain's piloting abilities. Comments from his line training said that improvement needed to be made in the area of standard operating procedures, crew management, and radio telephony. That last point was highlighted by investigators, as he reportedly utilized non-standard phraseology and even had trouble understanding the Nigerian accent during radio transmissions. A performance assessment on the captain revealed that his cockpit discipline was borderline inadequate. There was no evidence to suggest that this captain had improved his piloting abilities. Despite this, Captain Peter Waxton successfully passed his final line check with Dana Air on March 1, 2012. Little over a month later, he'd be dead. Investigators would later conclude that Captain Waxton was rushed through the pilot training and hurriedly hired by Dana Air, as investigators put it. Key pieces of the recruitment process were missing from the records: a general written test, selection interview, background check, and a 2-hour simulator appraisal check had never been recorded. There is no evidence to say that these were ever conducted. Additionally, there is no record of either of the 2 accident pilots receiving crew resource management training. This obviously brings into question the hiring practices and overall state of the airline. There was a shortage of qualified pilots in Nigeria. Dana Air had sort of bent the rules and cut corners a little bit to fill these positions, which resulted in the hiring of Captain Waxton, when really the system is supposed to filter a pilot like this out of the hiring pool. According to the accident report, it is indicated that the airline had a large turnover rate of pilots and looked abroad for workers to fill the gaps. Dana Air had actually violated Nigeria aviation laws by not conducting the necessary checks on the captain, as he was a foreign pilot. These background checks are crucial as they go into detail about any dismissals or revocation of licenses. If Dana Air had done that, they may have uncovered more of the captain's history with Spirit Airlines, Falcon Air, and the suspension of his license. But even on the day of the accident, more unusual things were reported. Before Flight 0992 left Abuja that afternoon, the captain, when pulling up to the stand on the arriving leg, ordered that the rear air stairs on the MD-80 were not to be used, and he was rather insistent about that, despite the MD-80 having perfectly usable rear air stairs for cabin access, and would have been preferable to have the additional entrance for the boarding of passengers. The reasoning for this was unknown, but did reportedly result in a disagreement or feud with other members of crew. Additionally, both the captain and first officer denied the request of the gate agent to board passengers when they were supposed to. Dana Air employees in Abuja would later say that this was because a meeting was taking place amongst the crew members. Again, the subject of this supposed meeting is not known. 3:13 that afternoon. Dana Air Flight 0992 had just taken off from Abuja and was climbing to an assigned altitude of 26,000 feet. First Officer Rator was at the flight controls for this leg. Captain Waxton was monitoring. The aircraft has been in the air for around 15 minutes. The pilots were finally getting settled, but the routine was interrupted when the pilots read the engine gauges only to notice that it appeared that the left engine was underperforming. The cockpit voice recording began picking up a conversation between the pilots about this engine issue. The cockpit voice recorder, along with the flight data recorder, were severely damaged in the accident. Flight data information was all but lost in the crash, but the final 31 minutes of the cockpit voice recording did survive. It just so happened that the beginning of that recording happened to include the pilots already mid-conversation about this problem. The number one engine parameters were down, and the left engine was not producing as much thrust as it otherwise should have been. Even after the pilots attempted to manipulate the thrust control, they got no response from the throttle. What the voice recording then picked up next gives us a bit of a window into the captain's headspace when it came to his flying that day. "We just want to get the f*** home," he says. The first officer pipes up, suggesting a meeting with the onboard engineer. Bring them to the flight deck to see if they could troubleshoot the problem. The captain refuses. "Well, I don't need him here, because we can figure it out. He's not going to be able to help us," the captain exclaims. The conversation continues with the pilots weighing up their options for dealing with this engine problem. The captain ponders as to whether anyone on the ground had manipulated or tampered with the panel at the rear cabin entrance, before saying in reference to someone, "This is the guy that had an issue with us. He's pissed off at us." From the evidence we have here, I couldn't with 100% certainty confirm who the captain was referring to here. However, sources do seem to strongly suggest that he was talking about this onboard engineer. He reportedly had a bit of a falling out with him, possibly over the disagreement about the rear air stairs in Abuja. Clearly though, in reference to their engine trouble, the pilots didn't make a great effort to deviate from their plan given the differential performance between the two engines. A twin-engine plane can fly on just one engine. Obviously, it's not ideal, and a scenario such as this would usually result in a diversion, or return to the departing airport in this case as they had just taken off. However, the flight continued and struggled onto Lagos, and the pilots only briefly and vaguely, as the accident report puts it, vaguely discussed the engine pressure ratio on the left engine, which was substantially lower than the right. In fact, as the flight progressed, the left engine was only providing idle power. So what the pilots ultimately decided to do was continue the flight to Lagos but begin a slow, steady descent. They estimated an arrival into Lagos of 3:43, about half an hour later. If there was one thing Captain Waxton was concerned about though, it was the thought that Nigerian authorities would look into this incident they were now a part of. "We're going to be investigated by the NCAA," he says. So let's address this now, before we get onto how the plane crashed. What actually was the issue with the engines? Obviously something was wrong with it, so let's take our time here to explore that a bit more. Not surprisingly perhaps, this links back to poor airline management at Dana Air, this time looking at their maintenance practices. To preface this before we dive deeper here, I was shocked, my jaw dropped when I first read over some of these details. The smartest way to fly? Well, we'll see about that. As we mentioned earlier, this MD-80 was once under the possession of Alaska Airlines. McDonnell Douglas, when they first designed the plane, contracted with Pratt & Whitney for the manufacturing of the plane's engines. Specifically, the Pratt & Whitney JT8D engines were chosen for the plane. It's an engine that was popular at the time, being featured on such planes like the Boeing 727 and early 737s. In 2001, Pratt & Whitney received a report following an engine fire about the possibility of fuel leaks as a result of fracturing of the fuel manifold, that being the piping where fuel to the engine is transported. In the following years, Pratt & Whitney published maintenance guidance on how to deal with this issue. Airplane parts have a service life, and there are a lot of factors that go into judging how long certain parts can be in service for. The fuel manifold was identified as being susceptible to fracturing, so Pratt & Whitney went to all operators of the MD-80 at the time and suggested that the fuel manifolds be replaced with new piping that was made of newer materials that would reduce the susceptibility of this fracturing of the fuel transport system. Dana Air, however, was founded much later than this in 2008, and obviously didn't get this memo. Now this is where maintenance at Alaska Airlines comes into the mix. Alaska Airlines in 2005 overhauled and replaced the right side engine on what would become the extant Dana Air plane. Well, actually, they sent that engine over to the aerospace division of Volvo, and they delivered it back to Alaska overhauled with these changes. That engine now conformed with the guidance issued by Pratt & Whitney. They did not replace or implement changes to the left engine, which was still performing as required at that time, and there really wasn't much of a need to overhaul it, so they didn't. So that same left engine that Captain Waxton and First Officer Rator would later find unresponsive in 2012 was left on the plane by Alaska Airlines when the plane was transferred to Dana Air in 2009. So let's shift focus over to these guys. What did Dana Air do to the plane? Well, Dana Air, like Alaska Airlines, outsourced their engine maintenance on the MD-80. In West Africa, there weren't all that many options for suitable engine maintenance, so the airline looked further afield and contracted with a company called Millennium Engine Associates. These guys weren't based in Nigeria. Instead, their base of operations could be found in, let me check here. Oh, for God's sake, Florida again? Oh my god, dude. Oh my god. In 2011, Dana Air sent engine number 1, that being the one that would eventually fail on the accident flight. That engine was sent to a Millennium shop in Miami, specifically here. Whilst the engine was here in Florida, it was overhauled. But investigators later found that the work that was done here on the engine did not conform with the bulletins and guidance set out by Pratt & Whitney. Investigators later concluded that Millennium had installed the fuel manifold incorrectly on the overhauled engine, in such a way that it enabled bending stress on the inlets. The investigation provides this image, which allows one to see the problem more clearly. This is the fairing containing the fuel manifold. When compared to a photograph of a correctly installed fairing, you can even more clearly see the issue. Basically, here's what was happening. Heated air flowing into the poorly installed fairing over time wore out the inlet tube until it eventually broke. This is believed to be what happened to the engine on Flight 0992. In simple terms, fuel supply to the engine was severed, resulting in the lack of throttle response the flight crew experienced. Not only was the left engine on the extant MD-80 sent to Millennium in Florida, but also the right side number 2 engine, and multiple other engines of other planes in Dana Air's fleet. With testimony from Dana Air's pilots, it was found that multiple of their planes had been experiencing slowing acceleration. Poor installation of the fuel manifold and inlet fairing ultimately led to the failure and collapse of the fuel transport system during the accident flight. Further adding to the list of troubles, it did not help that the investigation later reported a poor workplace culture amongst Dana Air pilots. An unusual fuel management practice was uncovered. Pilots at Dana Air had been known to completely deplete the center fuel tank of its contents without using any of the wing tanks. This was in contrast to normal procedures that require a minimum threshold of fuel to be stored in the center tanks. Additionally, a habit of just not recording defects in the logbooks had also developed. This led to important maintenance not being carried out. Even worse, pilots who had complained about problems with Dana airplanes were forced to fly them anyway. The proverbial can was kicked down the road, so to speak. The problem there is, eventually, you catch up with the can. But get this, we're not done tackling all of the details about the state of Dana Air's planes. Investigators identified a further environmental condition compounding against Dana Air's poor upkeep of their planes. Nigeria is, as you are no doubt aware, a hot, humid, tropical country. Air carriers need to take into account the climate conditions of the region for storing and maintaining their planes, or else, in the case of a tropical climate, be subject to possible damage in a number of different ways. For example, it has been known that in climates such as Nigeria's, if a plane is left out in the sun for too long in hot temperatures, and given the high local air moisture content, a fungus can develop inside of the fuel system. Spores mixing with water can lead to fungal growth that, if untreated, causes obstructions, blockages, and failure of the fuel flow, not to mention fuel contamination, corrosion of the fuel tanks, and of course, fuel leakage. We call this microbiological contamination, and it's believed that Dana Air had enabled an environment like this within their fleet. Investigators with this finding would issue a safety recommendation to the airline, requiring them to perform visual inspections of the fuel tanks. All of this paints a picture of an airline operating planes in poor condition, with improper maintenance, being flown by questionable pilots, some with dubious backgrounds. The airline itself had a high turnover rate of pilots and rushed many of them through pilot training to get them in the air. Very poor airline management compounded against a broken plane and the actions of a poor pilot that day. This was a disaster waiting to happen. So how did it all go wrong on June 3rd, 2012? Looking back at the accident flight, we now know why the left engine had failed. The critical fuel line supplying the engine with fuel had broken after succumbing to poor maintenance. The pilots chose to continue the flight anyway. There are checklists for many different types of non-normal scenarios, including engine failure. The checklist they possessed called for them to divert. They didn't. Between Abuja and Lagos, there are multiple other suitable airports. The Dana Air pilots even had a checklist that specified Ibadan Airport as being a suitable alternate, but still they chose to continue the flight. During the approach to Lagos, the captain wanted to increase the rate of descent. The first officer objected and opted to continue their slower, steadier descent. The time was 3:40 in the afternoon. Flight 0992 has descended to below 8,000 feet, and the pilots begin their final approach. Again, let's remember, they are now effectively down to the use of just one engine. Let's take a moment to familiarize ourselves with the airport in Lagos. Lagos Airport has two runways with a north-south orientation, with the main terminal area in the center, though an additional passenger terminal can also be found on the east side of the airport. The airport grounds themselves contain a lot of greenery around the perimeter of the airport. Beyond this, however, it is completely surrounded by the urban landscape of Lagos. Originally, the accident flight was cleared for an approach onto runway 18 left, although this was changed to 18 right as requested by the pilots. However, when local air traffic control began to vector the plane for their approach, that was when uncertainty between the pilots began to grow. Even after confirming once again that there was no response from the left engine, they still continued the flight without issuing any form of distress signal, mainly because they still had the right engine, and they even took a moment to switch off the engine bleed air and anti-ice systems. So a quick explanation here. Bleed air from the engines is basically some of the air that has come through the engine intake, and instead of it being used for propulsion, it is siphoned off and directed for other uses around the plane, such as the anti-ice system or air conditioning, for example. Switching the bleed air off allows that extra air to be used by the engine, giving way to a slight increase in engine performance. Captain Waxton had taken over the flight controls from the first officer. He closes the right side throttle and increases the rate of descent as they were a little bit too high for their approach profile. The captain, bringing the plane toward the airport, inevitably needed to slow the rate of descent and increase thrust again on their only functioning engine. At 3:41, 11 miles from the runway, now passing over the outskirts of northern Lagos, he reaches down to the throttle control, commands thrust from the right side number 2 engine, and it fails to respond. Oh shit. Dual engine failure, at low altitude, and now between them and the safety of a runway is miles of populated, high-density urban sprawl. It was only now, once the second engine had failed, that the pilots really began to grapple with the gravity of the situation. The first officer picks up the intercom. The senior flight attendant wants to know what's going on. The pilots say they've got it under control. At 3:42, they finally issue a Mayday distress call to the ground. The pilots, once again, fail to consult the emergency checklists. The accident report explains how between when the second engine failure occurred and the now inevitable crash, the pilots attempted to recover engine power without using any checklist. "We just lost everything. We lost an engine. I lost both engines," the captain says. Now desperate to fix their situation, the pilots begin throwing anything they can at the plane to fix the problem. relight, ignition override, just anything, were some of the last recorded words on the plane. The plane now has no thrust and is forced to descend lower and lower, but they were still miles from Lagos Airport. Out of options, with nowhere to put the plane down, Captain Waxton tries to extend the plane's glide. The plane's own automated voice sounding out the plane was too low begins to ring throughout the flight deck. These warnings were the last sounds the pilots heard before their deaths. At 3:44 and 33 seconds, just under 6 miles from the airport, Dana Air Flight 0992 crashes into a densely populated residential area of Lagos. The plane crashed here in the Iju-Ishaga district of the city. The main section of the plane impacted a 2-floor building. The right wing clipped nearby trees and damaged 3 other buildings in the process. The subsequent explosion from the impact killed all 153 people on board the plane. A further 6 lives on the ground were taken, bringing the death toll to 159. The death toll could have been greater than this, as one of the now destroyed buildings was actually an apartment building which was under construction at the time. Had the building been fully occupied, more could have been killed. This is the deadliest air disaster to have occurred in Nigeria for decades, and is amongst the worst air accidents to have involved the MD-80. The disaster follows a long string of devastating accidents in Nigeria in the 2000s. It's another blow to the country's already tattered safety record. Public confidence in Nigeria's aviation industry shatters. The Nigerian Accident Investigation Bureau led the investigation, with the American National Transportation Safety Board observing the process. Boeing and Pratt & Whitney also lent assistance. Whilst the investigation got to work understanding how this disaster unfolded, Dana airplanes were grounded. Though we have already gone over the critical engine problem with the plane, we should highlight that for investigators, getting their conclusions was extremely difficult in this case. Investigators did focus in on the engines early on. From the wreckage, it was clear to investigators that both engines had indeed failed, and weren't supplying power when the plane crashed. Investigators dug a bit deeper into the background of Dana Air and found out who did the work on their engines. So they sent the accident plane's engines back to the company who had overhauled them the previous year, Millennium Engine Associates in Florida. There, the engines were disassembled and examined. Getting a closer look at the fuel system, investigators found those fractures in the fuel manifold. The first indication the engines had not been maintained in accordance with the guidance of Pratt & Whitney. However, at this point, there was no way to tell that this occurred before the crash. Nigerian investigators requested that the engines be transported back to Nigeria for further examination. However, Millennium only sent back the relevant parts of the left engine, which to be fair was the one that failed first. This was where investigators sort of hit a bit of a dead end. They figured the failure of the engines had something to do with a faulty fuel system, but weren't able to prove it. That was until a number of months later, when everything changed. Nigerian authorities had allowed Dana Air to continue operations. However, in October 2013, Dana Air Flight 0348 had suffered a very particular failure. As this plane, another former Alaska Airlines MD-80, was climbing out on departure, the pilots noticed they weren't getting any response from the throttle controls on their engines. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? The pilots in that case turned around and landed safely, then an investigation was launched. Removing the faulting engine from the plane, investigators got a closer look and found that the fairing containing the fuel manifold was incorrectly installed onto the plane. This aircraft had also been serviced by Millennium Engine Associates in the United States. They had been able to observe that the inlet pipe had broken away from its fitting. That was when this image was taken. It is believed that this is what led to the engine failure on board Flight 0992 on June 3, 2012. For all of the problems with the accident plane, the poor state of the engines and fuel system aside, the main cause of the crash was put down to pilot error. Listening into the cockpit voice recording was damning for investigators. They found the captain's conduct to be shocking, with his casual use of profanity and inability to adhere to procedures. At the end of the day, one engine had already failed, and the flight crew failed to appropriately manage the plane as required. They had more than enough time to divert or turn back to Abuja, but didn't. Here is the investigation's conclusion on the causal factors. Engine number 1 lost power 17 minutes into the flight, and thereafter, on final approach, engine number 2 lost power and failed to respond to throttle movement on demand for increased power to sustain the aircraft in its flight configuration. Contributing to the accident, the inappropriate omission of the use of the checklist and the crew's inability to appreciate the severity of the power-related problem and the subsequent failure to land at the nearest suitable airfield, lack of situational awareness, inappropriate decision-making, and poor airmanship. There is still one question that remains. We know why the left engine failed. We've talked about it a lot here today. However, none of this really explains why the second engine failed. This is unfortunately where we do hit a dead end. We don't really know why the second engine failed. Some believe that pilot error may have meant the pilots had mistakenly misconfigured their fuel selection, thus inadvertently starving the engine of fuel. Others speculated a bird strike, but I don't think that's true. Investigators dismantled the right side engine looking for clues and found no evidence of a collision with a foreign object. And though bending of the fuel flow pipes was found and comparable to the left engine, this did not fully obstruct fuel flow. They couldn't really find any good reason as to why the right side engine would fail. Remember Millennium Engine Associates, that engine maintenance company based in Miami? We know investigators worked with them to find answers, but when it was requested that the right engine be brought back to Nigeria for further analysis, they just didn't send it back, for reasons that are unknown. As a result, investigators weren't able to determine the cause of the second engine failure. Millennium Engine Associates has undergone a massive change since then. They moved location and rebranded under an international maintenance company known as Global Engine Maintenance, with bases in various places throughout the world. They now primarily focus on repairs of the ever-popular CFM56 engine. To this day, the company maintains association with airlines in Nigeria, but the whereabouts of that engine are still not known. So what has become of Dana Air, you might ask? With the fallout from the investigation into Flight 0992, investigators ordered Dana Air to fix their recruitment process, maintenance practices, and pilot training. But did Dana Air clean up their act? Though Nigerian aviation authorities had suspended Dana Air's operations after the accident, their flights did eventually resume, and the carrier continued to fly passengers. However, unfortunately, the airline has been plagued with safety concerns ever since. On multiple occasions, Nigerian authorities grounded their planes out of precaution. The airline has been in the news multiple times in Nigeria since. In 2018, a door fell off one of their planes during taxiing. That same month, there was another incident involving one of their MD-80s going off the runway after landing. Problems have persisted at Dana Air even into the 2020s. In July 2022, the Nigeria Civil Aviation Authority had again suspended their operating licenses and grounded their planes on account of failing a financial audit. However, this grounding was short-lived, and Dana Air took to the skies again in November 2022, only to once again be plagued by maintenance issues. The airline had to suspend flights due to maintenance problems in March 2023, resuming flights that same month, and Dana Air is still around today. Now that would be where the video ends, although I have to ask because I couldn't help but notice something during the production of this video. The past 3 weeks of my life has been in part consumed with trying to track down a Dana Air flight. Okay, so Dana Air is still around. You can go to their barely functional website right now and buy a ticket. I mean, I don't know why you would, but you can. They have a social media they regularly post on, but are they actually, flying? This seems like it would be a really easy thing to check, right? And the best short answer I can give here is, I think Dana Air is currently operating, at least as I speak to you now in September 2023. So why do I say it like that? Well, I went to have a look at live flight tracking to see if I could find some Dana Air planes, see what their flight history was like, how often they flew, stuff like that. But when I opened Flight Radar 24, continuously checking over multiple days, which turned into weeks, I realized I couldn't find any. So, I went to the websites of Lagos and Abuja Airport and was able to see Dana Air listed on the arrivals board, which only served to perplex me. So, I went back to some flight tracking and was able to track down every other notable Nigerian airline on these live flight tracking services. IBM Air, Green Africa Airways, Airic Air, Air Peace, Josh Cahill's favorite airline, and even a new airline called ValueJet. But no Dana Air could be found. I even went to additional services and, sure enough, even FlightAware just flat out says they have no recent tracking data. So, what's going on? Is Dana Air actually flying or not? Sources seem to be a bit conflicting. On one hand, I have been unsuccessful in tracking any Dana Air flight. Additionally, Nigerian social media is filled with complaints about this airline regarding cancelled flights and not issuing refunds. And then we also have sources which state that Dana Air's fleet is currently stored. Now, I am not in a position to fly out to Nigeria to verify myself, but on the flip side, Dana Air is apparently selling tickets. Lagos Airport's social media will occasionally post a flight update telling travelers one of their planes is about to depart, and you can also check social media and clearly see travelers posting pictures and updates about their Dana Air flights. Yet you still can't, or at least I couldn't, seem to track any. That was until I found a bit of a clue. So there is one Dana airplane that is returning data. 5 November Sierra Alpha India, which is actually that additional MD-80 of theirs that suffered the same fuel failure as the Axton plane. Yeah, that plane is returning some form of recorded data, but in tiny, fragmented amounts. Why only this plane? Why is it only a thing with Dana Air? Why don't I have this issue with Air Peace? It was at this point that I realized that this probably wasn't worth my time, and I just concluded that I think they're currently flying, but really I just don't know. Or as we say where I'm from, I've no idea, pet. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that Dana Air has struggled on and have become known as being a very poor service airline. You see, countless delays, poor customer service, and withholding of refunds for cancelled flights has kept Dana Air in the local Nigerian news cycle. Social media is filled with complaints about Dana Air. This guy has apparently been owed money for a cancelled flight for months, and they blocked him! What the f- Another individual apparently had his luggage opened and, quote, loaded with items that are prohibited on flights. That was only a few days ago. Dana Air, for high safety standards, quality in-flight service, and on-time performance, you can count on us. Nigeria is all like, how big does this pile have to be? To be fair, not to get too carried away, since Flight 0992, Dana Air has never suffered another fatal incident. And in all seriousness, the safety recommendations issued by investigators appears to have improved safety in the country, and air accidents are now rare in Nigeria. Let's hope it stays that way. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video, I really appreciate it. This video, I have to say, I really didn't expect it to take so much time to make. I thought this was going to be a shorter one, and then I just kept reading over the details and going into some of the stuff with the airline. There was just so much here. Anyway, if you enjoyed it, please do subscribe so that you do not miss the next one. I think I was feeling a bit ill whilst I was making this one. I think my Geordie accent comes out a bit more when I'm under the weather. I think I can hear it more in this one compared to other videos. A big thank you to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check the link in the description, and you've also got the promotional code in there too. Anyway, it is that time where I must take a moment to thank my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their amazing ongoing support to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks to you. We got some shoutouts to do today, so at the middle tier, a thank you to DeHeretic060820, Ben Olak, and Craig Marshall. Thank you so much. Big thanks to those who pledged at the highest tier. Thank you to Anon and Alexander Famerling. You guys are awesome, total legends. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can always join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the description of this video. All patrons get early access to all new videos 2 days before they release publicly on YouTube. That is all from me today. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, the link to that will also be down there somewhere. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day or evening if you're one of those people who watch my videos to fall asleep to. If you've made it this far, then good night. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.